Pharmaceutical CEO, laughed when Maid's daughter applied to his lab. What she did next shocks him. The floor-to-ceiling windows of Hanlon Pharmaceutical's executive suite offered a commanding view of the city below, where the morning sun cast long shadows across steel and glass. In this temple of modern medicine and corporate ambition, Dr. Richard Hanlon stood with his hands clasped behind his back, surveying his domain like a monarch surveying his kingdom. At 58, he had built an empire from nothing, or so he told himself. His tailored Valentino suit cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his Rolex caught the light with the kind of gleam that only came from precious metals and precious little else. Genius recognizes genius, he would often say to his board of directors. I hire only the brightest minds, the sharpest intellects. Sentiment is a liability in this business. Compassion is a luxury we cannot afford. The morning of Emily Vargas's application began like any other. Richard's executive assistant, Margaret, placed a stack of applications on his mahogany desk, 37 hopeful resumes from prestigious universities around the world. Yale, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, each applicant meticulously groomed for success, each one representing the genetic lottery that Richard believed determined everything in life. But one file seemed to mock the others. As he flipped through the stack, his fingers stopped. The application was different. The paper was thinner, slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been handled by nervous hands more than once. He read the first line and felt something like contempt rising in his throat. Applicant: Emily Maria Vargas, age 19, current status, high school graduate, mother's occupation, domestic housekeeping staff. Richard's laugh was sharp, almost vicious. He laughed the way powerful men laugh when confronted with the audacity of the powerless. He read the line aloud, his voice dripping with derision. Domestic housekeeping staff? A maid's daughter wants to work in my laboratory? She wants to research pharmaceutical development at the most prestigious biotech company in North America? He shook his head, still chuckling. What is this? Some kind of motivational video they're trying to get me to endorse? He tossed the file onto the rejection pile without reading further. It landed with a soft whisper, already forgotten. But Margaret, his HR director, was not one to remain silent. She had worked for Richard for 12 years, long enough to know his moods and how to navigate them. She also knew something else, something Richard had conveniently forgotten, or perhaps had never bothered to learn. Dr. Hanlon, she said carefully, approaching his desk with the measured steps of someone walking through a minefield. That application might warrant a closer look. Richard didn't even glance up from his emails. Why? Is her mother's expertise in floor wax formulation relevant to our vaccine research? She has a 4.0 GPA, Margaret continued, undeterred. She won the National Biology Science Olympiad 3 years in a row. She has published 2 peer-reviewed papers on cellular regeneration as a high school student in the Journal of Biomedical Research. And, sir, her mother is Maria Vargas. She's been your household manager for 12 years. The name hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. Richard's hands stilled on his keyboard. Maria Vargas. He remembered her vaguely, a quiet woman with dark hair that was beginning to gray, who came to his penthouse 3 times a week to maintain the space he barely lived in. He had never asked her about her life, never considered that she had one beyond the confines of his home. And, he said, his voice carefully controlled now, though something had shifted behind his eyes. "And, sir, Mrs. Vargas once told my assistant that her husband was a renowned chemical engineer. He passed away when Emily was 7. He was working on research related to rare genetic disorders when he developed one himself. Emily has been working to continue his research ever since." Richard's jaw tightened. He looked at the rejection pile, where Emily's file lay among dozens of others. Against his better judgment, or perhaps because of it, he picked it up again and actually read it this time. The application told a story that the single line about her mother's occupation had obscured. Emily had overcome obstacles that most Hanlon Pharmaceuticals applicants had never even had to consider. She had worked part-time jobs while maintaining perfect grades. She had taught herself advanced calculus and organic chemistry using library resources and online tutorials. Her personal statement was not flashy or designed to impress. It was simply honest. "I want to understand why people die," it read, "and how we can stop it. My father couldn't be saved by the medicines available when he needed them. Maybe I can help make sure someone else's father can." Richard closed the file. "Fine," he said, his voice clipped. "I'll interview her. I'm curious to see what kind of delusion it takes for someone with her background to apply here." The waiting area outside Richard's office was designed to intimidate. Everything was white and chrome and precisely arranged, like a space that had removed all trace of human comfort in the pursuit of clean lines and sterile efficiency. Emily sat on a white leather chair, her posture perfect, her hands folded in her lap. She wore a navy dress that had been mended multiple times. The stitching was visible along the hem if you knew how to look for it, and her blonde hair, inherited from her father, was pulled back severely to keep it out of her face. She was terrified, though no one looking at her would have known it. When Margaret called her name, Emily stood, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the open door of Richard's office. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. What she would say, how she would sit, how she would make herself seem worthy of the opportunity. But as she crossed the threshold into that vast space, with its intimidating views and its intimidating furniture, she felt all of her rehearsed words evaporate like morning mist. Richard didn't stand to greet her. He remained seated behind his desk, a deliberate power play that was as subtle as a sledgehammer. He gestured to the chair across from him without looking up from the file on his desk. "Sit," he commanded. Emily sat. She noticed that her feet didn't quite touch the floor. The chair was designed for someone taller, someone more substantial. It was another small humiliation, probably unintentional, but effective nonetheless. Richard finally looked at her. His eyes were ice blue, the color of something beautiful but cold. "Tell me, Miss Vargas, what makes you think you belong here? Not in this room, I mean. Here, at Hanlon Pharmaceuticals, at the top of the scientific world." Emily had prepared for many versions of this question, but something in Richard's tone, the casual cruelty of it, made her abandon her careful speech. Instead, she answered with the truth. "I don't know if I belong here," she said quietly, "but I know I have to try." "That's not an answer," Richard said coldly. "That's evasion. Try again." Emily took a breath. Her mother had always told her that the truth was a more powerful weapon than any lie, though she had never explained why someone would need a weapon in an interview. Now, Sitting across from this man who represented everything her family was not, Emily began to understand. "When I was 7 years old," she said, "my father was diagnosed with hereditary sensory and autonomic neuropathy. It's a rare genetic disorder. He was a chemical engineer. He worked for years trying to understand his own condition, thinking that if he could understand it, he could fix it. He thought he was close to something. He was working late at the lab when his condition worsened, and he collapsed. By the time someone found him, it was too late." She paused, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "My mother cleaned houses to pay for his medical bills and to keep our family afloat. She still works. She spent 12 years maintaining your penthouse because it was stable work that let her help me with school and homework and dreams that probably seemed impossibly far away. You asked, what makes me think I belong here? I belong here because my father belonged in a place like this, and the world failed him. I belong here because the next person who gets diagnosed with what my father had might have a chance that he didn't. And I belong here because I'm not willing to waste the opportunities that my mother fought so hard to give me." The office was silent. Outside, the city hummed with the sound of 9 million people going about their lives, most of them unaware that they lived in a world held together by the work of people like Emily's father, people like her mother, people whose names appeared in no headlines. Richard stared at Emily for a long moment. She could see something working behind his eyes, some internal struggle between the man he had built himself to be and perhaps the man he had been before ambition had calcified into cruelty. "Your father was a chemical engineer," he said finally. "Did he ever publish?" "2 major papers," Emily said, "and he left behind 4 notebooks filled with research notes. I've been trying to understand them since he died." "And have you? Understood them?" "Some," Emily said, "but most of them are beyond my current knowledge. I was hoping that coming here, working in a real laboratory with real equipment and real scientists, might help me finally finish what he started. That might sound naive." "It sounds desperate," Richard said. But his tone had changed. The cruelty had drained out of it, replaced by something more complicated. Which is not necessarily a bad quality in a scientist. Desperation is just passion, with a different name. He stood, walked to the window, and looked out at the city. "You're hired," he said without turning around, "on one condition." Emily's heart leaped and simultaneously plummeted. A condition. There was always a condition. "You bring those notebooks to me," Richard said. "Your father's research. I want to see what he was working on, and then you and I are going to discuss whether you're actually qualified for this position or whether I'm making an enormous mistake." "Yes," Emily said immediately. "Yes, thank you. I can bring them tomorrow." "Today," Richard interrupted, "after your shift. Margaret will tell you what to do. Welcome to Hanlon Pharmaceuticals, Miss Vargas. Try not to disappoint me." Emily did not disappoint him. Her first 3 months as a junior research assistant were unremarkable in most ways. She showed up early, stayed late, asked intelligent questions, and made herself useful without being intrusive. Her coworkers barely noticed her. She was the quiet girl from the state school, the one who ate her lunch alone and spent her break time reading scientific journals instead of scrolling through social media. To the elite scientists who staffed the lab, she was invisible. To Richard, however, she was becoming increasingly visible. He had read her father's notebooks. It had taken him a week of evenings spent in his penthouse, surrounded by the ghosts of his own ambition and the remnants of his own humanity, to get through them all. And with each page, he had felt something shifting inside him, some tectonic movement of conscience that threatened to upend everything he had built. Emily's father, Vincent Vargas, had been working on something revolutionary. His research on rare genetic disorders was not just thorough. It was elegantly designed, theoretically sound, and years ahead of its time. He had been on the verge of something significant when he ran out of time and resources. Hanlon Pharmaceuticals had been researching a similar approach, but they had stalled months ago. Richard realized, with a jolt of guilty recognition, that they had paid for the exact research they needed but had received nothing, because Vincent had done it for love instead of money, and love alone was not a currency that the pharmaceutical industry recognized. He began to privately monitor Emily's work. He read her lab reports. He watched the way she approached problems with a combination of intuition and rigor that suggested either genius or exhaustion, or both. He started to position research assignments that would naturally lead her toward her father's work. And then came the breakthrough. The vaccine project had been their white whale for 18 months. Hanlon Pharmaceuticals was attempting to develop a next-generation viral vaccine using a novel delivery mechanism. The theoretical framework was solid. The animal trials had gone well, but when they moved to cellular modeling, something was systematically failing. The enzyme cascade that should have stabilized the viral vector was instead destabilizing it. They were losing efficacy at a rate that made the entire approach seem impossible. Richard had assembled his best team, the PhDs from Caltech, the researchers with decades of experience, the scientists with 200 publications between them. They had worked for 6 months to solve the problem. They had submitted 3 white papers. They had hit a dead end so complete that Richard had begun considering either abandoning the project or buying a competing laboratory's research. It was 2 in the morning on a Thursday when Emily found the answer. She had not been assigned to the vaccine project. She was technically working on cellular regeneration studies, a much less prestigious assignment that most people at her level would have resented. But Emily had a habit of reading everything in the lab database, of cross-referencing projects, of asking questions that technically she did not need to ask. She had noticed the notes about the enzyme cascade problem and had become obsessed with it in the way that only young scientists can become obsessed with the work of others, purely, unselfishly, driven only by the desire to solve the puzzle. She had gone to the lab after her official shift ended. She had run her own analysis on her own time, using her own small allocation of computing power. And she had found it. The problem was not with the enzyme. The problem was with the assumptions they had been making about the enzyme's behavior at specific pH levels. It turned out that Vincent Vargas, in one of his notebooks, had documented something similar during his own research. Emily had connected the dots. She had realized that if they adjusted the buffer solution and introduced a chelating agent at a specific point in the cascade, the enzyme would not just stabilize, it would amplify the signal by a factor of 10. She had run the simulation. She had verified it 3 times, and then, uncertain of her authority and intimidated by the seniority of the team that had failed to see this, she had left the results on Richard's desk with a note in her careful handwriting. Possible solution for enzyme cascade problem. Please see attached analysis. Respectfully, Emily V. Richard found the note at 6:47 a.m. when he arrived at his office before dawn, as he did every morning. It was a ritual of his, the quiet time before the world woke up, the space to pretend that he was just a researcher like anyone else, that he was not the sum of his ambitions and compromises. He read Emily's analysis. Then he read it again. Then he read the simulation results. And then he walked down to the laboratory, where he knew Emily had been working until 3 in the morning. She was not there. She had finally gone home to sleep. Richard looked at the lab through the glass walls, and he saw it as if for the first time. He saw the work of hundreds of people, each of them trying to save the world, or at least their small corner of it. He saw the equipment that cost millions of dollars and the research that cost millions more, and he thought about how it was all built on the backs of people like Maria Vargas, who cleaned the offices and the homes, who made the infrastructure of genius possible. And he thought about how easily he would have rejected Emily's application, how easily he would have consigned her father's research to obscurity, assuming that if it was worth something, it would have been published, it would have been known, it would have come from somewhere prestigious. He called an emergency meeting of the entire vaccine team. He projected Emily's analysis on the screen. He watched their faces as they realized that a junior research assistant, a teenager, really, working at the margins of the project, had solved in a single night what they had failed to solve in 6 months. "This is Emily Vargas's work," he said. "From now on, she's leading this project. I don't care what your credentials are or how many papers you've published. She's leading this. And if anyone has a problem with that, you can discuss it with me in the parking lot." No one did. Emily did not know about the meeting. She arrived at the lab that morning to find herself reassigned to the vaccine project as the lead researcher. She stared at the email, certain there was some mistake. She went to find Richard, who was waiting for her in his office with 2 cups of coffee, one black, one with cream and sugar, the way Maria had probably told him Emily liked it. "Sit down," he said, but this time it was not a command. It was an invitation. Emily sat. Richard set her coffee in front of her and studied her face for a moment before speaking. "Your father was a brilliant man," he said without preamble. "I've read his research, every page. I understand what he was trying to do, and I understand why he ran out of time and money and support. I want you to know that it was not a failure on his part. It was a failure on the part of people like me, people who should have recognized genius when we encountered it but chose not to, because genius in our world comes with credentials. It comes with the right university name on the resume. It comes from a certain kind of background." Emily didn't know what to say. She had never heard Richard speak in this way, not with anger or contempt, but with something that sounded like regret. "I'm going to tell you something that I have never told anyone," he continued. "When I was starting out, I was your age, actually, or maybe younger, I met someone, another graduate student. Her name was Catherine. She was brilliant. She was going to change the world. She had all kinds of ideas about how pharmaceutical research should be more ethical, more focused on diseases that didn't make money, more concerned with saving lives than making profit. I told her she was naive. I told her that the world didn't work that way. And then I made a choice to go into business, to climb the corporate ladder, to prove that I was smarter than everyone else. Catherine went a different direction. She worked for a nonprofit. She spent her career researching Ebola treatments that she would never be able to patent or profit from. Last year, she got infected with the disease she spent her life fighting. She died. She was 46 years old. He paused. He looked out at the city, and Emily thought she saw something like grief in his eyes. "I think Catherine was right," he said. "I think genius is not just about the smartest solution to the most profitable problem. I think genius is about recognizing what matters and having the courage to pursue it even when the world tells you it doesn't matter. Your father had that, and you have it too." "What happened to your research?" Emily asked quietly. "After your father died, I mean. What happened to his work?" Richard was quiet for a long moment. "After your father passed, I went to the estate sale," he said. "Your mother was selling his things, books, equipment. I found a set of his research notebooks, and I bought them. I thought I would read them, and they would be nothing, that I was just being sentimental. But they weren't nothing. They were extraordinary, and yet no one knew about them. No one knew they existed, because your father didn't have the platform or the resources or the network to make his work visible. The system is designed to make people like your father invisible." "But I'm visible now," Emily said, understanding what he was telling her. "Yes," Richard said, "and I'm going to make sure you stay visible. I'm going to fund your research, all of it. Your father's work, your work, whatever you want to pursue, and I'm going to do something else. I'm going to start recruiting people like you, people with raw talent and unconventional backgrounds. Because if I can find one genius in my household manager's daughter, imagine what else is out there. Imagine how many brilliant minds are being systematically excluded because they come from the wrong place or the wrong family or the wrong economic situation." Emily felt tears prickling at her eyes. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Richard said, "I want your forgiveness for every time I dismissed your mother. Every time I treated her like she was part of the furniture, every time I failed to recognize that she had sacrificed everything for you. I can't change the past, but I can change the future. And maybe that's the only form of redemption that's actually available to people like me." The vaccine that Emily led the development of was approved by the FDA 2 years later. It was not a cure-all, but it was effective against a class of rare genetic disorders that had claimed tens of thousands of lives. The research team consisted of 30 people, including Emily as the primary researcher, and several other people whose backgrounds were not traditional, who had worked their way up from nothing, who had learned science in unconventional ways, who had been systematically underestimated. Richard did something unprecedented in the pharmaceutical industry. He made the research data available to every university in the world. He dropped the profit margin on the vaccine to the bare minimum needed to sustain research operations. He donated 50% of the profits to organizations that researched diseases that did not have wealthy funding, that took years to study because the market was small and the suffering was invisible. The industry called him naive. Some of his board members demanded that he reconsider his strategy. But the vaccine saved lives. It saved millions of dollars in subsequent medical interventions. And more importantly, it proved that there was another way to do business, a way that did not require the systematic devaluation of human beings or the erasure of genius that came from unexpected places. 2 years after the vaccine was approved, Richard was diagnosed with the same disorder that had claimed Emily's father. He had suspected it for months, but had delayed testing, afraid of what he would find. The irony was not lost on him that the very research he had almost abandoned, the work he had initially mocked as impossible, was now saving his life. When he was finally released from the hospital after 6 weeks of treatment, Emily and her mother came to visit him at home. Maria brought food that she had cooked herself, arroz rojo and empanadas and flan, the flavors of her heritage and her love. They sat together in Richard's penthouse, in the space that Maria had cleaned hundreds of times, and shared a meal. Richard held Maria's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, "for everything, for raising a daughter who is braver and smarter than I will ever be, for working so hard so that she could have opportunities that I took for granted." Maria smiled, and there was grace in her face, the kind of grace that comes from a life lived with integrity, from hands that have done hard work without bitterness, from a spirit that has remained unbroken by the world's indifference. "You gave her a chance," Maria said. "That's what a good man does. He recognizes talent and gives it a chance to grow." Emily watched the two of them, and she thought about her father, about Vincent Vargas, the chemical engineer who had wanted to save the world but had run out of time. She thought about how genius was not just an accident of birth or education, but a choice to pursue truth and meaning in a world that often seemed indifferent to both. She thought about how the small act of opening a door, of truly seeing someone instead of dismissing them, could change everything. She had just been accepted to a joint MD-PhD program at Harvard. She was planning to study rare genetic diseases and to establish her own research lab focused on diseases that the pharmaceutical industry had deemed too unprofitable to pursue. She was 21 years old, and the world was still uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. In the fading light of the penthouse, as evening settled over the city like a blanket, the three of them sat together in silence. And in that silence was the sound of redemption, not the kind that erased the past or undid the damage that indifference and arrogance had caused, but the kind that acknowledged it and committed to doing better. Because that, in the end, was what genius looked like. Not the flash of a single breakthrough, but the slow, steady work of building a world where brilliance could emerge from anywhere, where the daughter of a housemaid could become a scientist, and where a man broken by his own ambition could discover late in life what it meant to truly matter.